Let's get this show on the road. Thank you so much for attending. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we will speak with organizations that support people of color and women in their pursuit of careers in STEM. Today we're chatting with Tara EcoHawk, CEO of ISIS. Did I get that right, Sarah?
ACES.
ACES, I'm sorry,
That's all right.
AIS, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, and Tara Chklovski, founder and CEO of Technovision. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show and we'll announce results. And questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. We always love questions. It always enriches the discussion, so please do contribute. So thank you both for joining. This is just a wonderful discussion. STEM professionals, they're in high demand, and a grounding in science, tech, engineering, and math is a critical gateway to so many careers. So let's chat a little bit about why it's important to have dedicated programs that support STEM education for those who have been discouraged from pursuing STEM education and STEM-oriented careers. Sarah, could you take the first cut of why it's important to have an organization that focuses on science, technology, engineering, and math education for Native American peoples, and particularly given the educational history in this country and how we address that?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having me today. Appreciate it. So now, hello, I'm Tara EcoHawk. I'm a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. And as Mark said, the CEO of the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, or ACES. And really why ACES was originally started was because of the lack of representation in science and engineering for Native peoples. And since then, really have broadened that mission to include all of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And primarily, I mean, there's a multitude of reasons why it's important, but I would say the primary reason that we see it is from an economic standpoint. Many of the fastest growing, highest paying jobs are in the STEM fields. And so we know if we're talking about issues of equity in terms of economics, that we need to have, Native people need to have access to STEM education and STEM career development. And that historically, as you mentioned, hadn't been the case just in education in general, had been used for so long as a tool to assimilate Native people into mainstream culture, really removing their culture from it. So what we have discovered at ACES is that by allowing that culture to permeate what people are doing in terms of STEM education and then even in their own careers, that really makes that connection back. And our people see the relevance of STEM in their lives and understand that there's a connection there. So we do a lot of cultural contextualization of curriculum and support employers in how they develop their internal environments to support Indigenous peoples once they're hired, to support them in their career journey and onward. So we actually host the largest college and career fair for Native people annually at our national conference, where we have about 250 colleges and universities and employers, corporations, government agencies, tribes, and nonprofits who are there to recruit Native STEM talent. So we've been very, very successful in helping Native people get into those jobs, get those educations, and finally working with tribes directly to develop STEM infrastructure, so a STEM workforce, and help them in terms of building their own tribal businesses and that tribal infrastructure there.
There's so much that's about education that is about transmission of information, but also about indoctrination. We see this in terms of gender roles.
Yeah.
We see this in terms of the differences in how education is unfolded for people of different races and backgrounds. And basically what you're doing is you're seizing control over the content, and you're determining what the content should be. Tara, you have another interesting take on this, because you're addressing this disparity in STEM education for girls, for women. Talk a little bit about your take on this idea of education transmitting information that is really important for careers, and the whole issue of gender roles and how we should see that through your eyes.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and good to be on this panel with you, Sarah, and to learn about the work that you're doing. So Technovation's mission is to empower girls and young women to basically tackle problems that they see in their communities using the most powerful tools of the time. So in some sense, it's less about the transmission of knowledge and more of like success for us is that young women build a sense of agency, that if there's a problem, they are the ones to tackle it. And it's a little bit different from really like transmission of knowledge. And I think it's understanding that these are real complex problems that need people to work together to tackle them. And so a big part of the competition is that they have to work in teams with a mentor from a different field, and to actually deploy a solution in the real world that requires understanding of ethical constraints, and really sort of from start to finish of real world problem solving and actually seeing how your solution works in the real world. So the reason why we emphasize girls, and of course, a lot of it is working in communities of color and low, is that they're really never part of the inventors club. And I think I was reading an interesting article, I think in The Guardian, that came out a couple of days ago that said most of Silicon Valley's critics are women. And that's an interesting insight where they're just not part of the conversation of creating these large scale technologies that are deployed, but they are definitely users, right? And so there's so many books like Race After Technology, Algorithms of Oppression, that talk about how technology doesn't serve minority groups well. And there's no country in the world that has gender equality. And the Me Too movement started in the US. So gender issues are the strongest where you have the most power, the most influence, and the tech sector, STEM fields are these fields that have tremendous impact and influence on our lives. And it's just critical that they are better represented by different communities and different types of people. So that's the reason why we exist.
So one of the things that I find so interesting is that the country benefits, this whole idea of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the country benefits when people are self-sufficient, right? American self-sufficiency. The whole idea of us all becoming job creators, right? Having agency. Yet in our education system is predicated so often on past models that mitigate against that. So let's talk about the non-educational content piece. That topic that you talked about, Tara, and that you talked about, Sarah, about the cultural attributes that you try to imbue, the empowerment attributes that you try to have your programs informed by. So let's talk about how that actually is transmitted. What is the initial predicate, Sarah, in terms of people participating in your program? How do you start off with when you inform people about what you're about in terms of the non-informational piece, but the cultural elements of what you're doing?
Well, first off, ACES has what's called a council of elders that really are spiritual and cultural guiders, if you will, from across the US and Canada, who really advise us in all of our work, all of our programming and everything that we do. And that connection is made by all of the people that participate in ACES. That's kind of the connection to culture, because often as Native people, in schools and or in the workforce, you might be the only Native person in your school or in your company. And so really having to have that connection point back is really something that ACES strives to do. And so we incorporate culture in all that we do. And it's hard to explain unless you've really attended an ACES event or been part of it. But to see that in action, maybe through education, an example would be there was a class that we did in conjunction with Intel that we created at a couple of Navajo high schools on the Navajo reservation. And it was all to prep students who were interested in going into a tech career or a tech major in college. So they were juniors and seniors. And we worked with cultural experts in the community and in writing that curriculum, if you will. And part of that, for example, was like lessons around engineering were tied to Navajo weaving and the way that that is done, right? Or we did a class with young kids, and it wasn't even a class, it was an out-of-school activity with kids up on the Cheyenne River Reservation, where we did a chemistry lesson around brain tanning of buffalo hide. So it's making that cultural connection back so that students see the relevance in that. And so, and they understand that their culture doesn't have to be separate from who they are, what they do. And as Native people, and at ACES, we also embrace TEK, which is traditional ecological knowledge, and really incorporate that and have Native-led research presentations, things of that nature. So again, it's kind of hard to talk about and to explain, but really the cultural piece flows through everything that we do. And that's where the connection comes in and why we've been so successful. And why the organization has grown so much over the last 8 years.
You're doing a great job of explaining it. This whole idea of how we should function within the business world, that it's not just about one thing, right? Mm-hmm. That there are cultural connections, that elders who might not have the most modern of knowledge about engineering or technology, that elders can actually inform what we learn. And Tara, you also made reference to this idea of empowerment, of having agency, of that cultural attribute of having agency and being empowered is as important as the technical information that you impart. In fact, you seem to imply that it was even more important than just the pure data that a girl or a woman would learn. Is that how you approach your mission, that it is about agency as much as it's about knowledge?
Definitely. And I think we all these are very complex social issues that I think don't have just one important solution, but a host of things that you have to get right. It's like a checklist. And I think we have a whole pyramid of skills that we want to build on. The foundation, of course, is the technical skills, because without that foundation, like if you don't know how to read, it's very hard to say that you'll be able to write and actually contribute and share your voice. So it's a similar thing. Like it's the first step. But a big part of it is being able to apply that knowledge to real world problems and to understand, build the skills that help you. It's the journey of an entrepreneur where you have to understand, how do you set goals? How do you manage your time? How do you motivate yourself past a very complex, it's not an hour of code, it's 12 weeks of finding a problem, taking it to the market, field testing it, getting feedback, iterating, and actually being able to drive something into the real world where people are using it and you don't want to harm anybody. And so those are all the constraints that I think school typically has been sort of a content delivery mechanism. And I think project-based learning is a way of making it more engaging, but there's still quite a bit of work to be done where you are actually empowering young people to tackle some of these large problems of climate change, COVID is not just a health crisis. We know it's a justice issue, it's a climate issue. And so those are the kinds of things that young people are going to be having to tackle in today. And so who's giving them the skills that helps them deal with these complex issues. And to me, it's less about the culture and more about the right sort of sequence of skills that they need to be able to thrive. And I think it's the underpinnings of sustainable development where people and the planet have to thrive together.
So it is a series of skills that allow people to employ those STEM knowledge as much as it is the STEM knowledge itself, is what you're saying, Tara.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I think voice, influence, agency are some of the key pieces here that we have to keep in mind.
The other thing that strikes me about the answers that both of you are giving is that there seems to be a community piece to what you're talking about. In other words, there is an implied obligation of people who have experienced disparity to heal those disparities for future generations. Is that how you each see it, Tara? In terms of your staff, are a lot of people who are engaged on your staff and your board, people come out of these fields and want to see them function better for girls and women?
For sure. I mean, but I think it's beyond our staff. My staff is 21 people, full-time people, but every year we engage roughly between 30,000 to 50,000 participants, and roughly half of them are students and the other half are adults, volunteers from the communities, educators, mentors who dedicate hundreds of hours to ensuring that young people are developing these skills. So the mentors work with the students to identify problems in their communities, and together, so it's a key part of sort of upskilling for these mentors too. Very few people know how to code a mobile app. Very few people know how to build an AI agent, but they're learning with the young people together. And so it's an incredible network of supporters. And we saw with COVID, there's a lot of discussion around lack of access to internet and devices, which is a sort of increasing the digital gap. But what we found was that even more important was the lack of social capital, where the community that were able to bring these kinds of to young girls, they really, the key difference was they had incredible champions who were able to act quickly and bring these extra resources to the communities that needed them. And so I think as the conversation we talk about Build Back Better, I think it has to move beyond just the tangible things of like access and let me hand you a tablet or let me give you internet access, because even when people have internet access, they spend most of their time on Facebook and YouTube. They're not spending their time building and creating and tackling some of these hard problems. For us to be able to do that, we have to make sure that they have a mentor who helps them through this journey. And so I think that is something where this impact is not going to happen without a community of supporters.
So we just completed 2 polls, very interesting results. We very rarely get 100% of anything in this country, but we got 100% consensus. The first poll was, do you believe that American schools adequately support all students, male, female, and others, people of all backgrounds and ethnicities, equally in STEM education? And the resounding answer was no. 100% of respondents said no. They did not believe that there was equal support for all people. And then there's the second poll, also equally interesting. What do you think is the primary reason for disparities in education? And we offered 5 or 6, I think 5 different options. And we got 100% systematic disparities embedded into our education system that require fundamental change in how we educate. That's very interesting. So you've got 100% now, of course, it's a select audience, but 100% of people believe that there are fundamental changes that are required. So Sarah, let's take that as a mission. What kind of fundamental, and I'm talking about our public education system, our colleges, our community colleges, our schools. What kind of fundamental changes are required in order to level the playing field from your perspective, so that your organization is less necessary to help level the playing field that starts off as not being leveled?
That's a big question. I could take two things come to mind. One, for at least for our population as Indigenous peoples, our issue is always that of misconceptions about our population and our invisibility. So what happens often with our kids in the public school system or even in the BIA schools is Native Americans as in the contemporary sense are never discussed. If you go and you type into a web browser Native American, most of the pictures that are going to come up are going to be pre-1900. And if you do that with other populations, that's not the case. So are there stereotypes around our people that really put us at a disadvantage? There's been studies showing, there's a study called Reclaiming Native Truth that's out there that talks about the negative impact on Native children, that these stereotypes that are perpetuated about us and the way that education handles Native Americans in terms of our history and our political status is harmful to our population. So that's not necessarily specific to STEM, but that's kind of overarching what our population deals with just walking in the door before we even talk about, education. And so then it becomes this issue of, again, of communicating, connecting with our populations and what needs to be done in terms of racial equity and having those conversations. The only other thing I'll add really quickly is, and I'm sure Tara can talk a lot more about this, but for Native American girls, Indigenous girls, traditionally most of our societies were matrilineal and matriarchal, and so women had that role, and then that had kind of been usurped by the process of colonization, and we saw a real decline. And this is still the case that in the STEM fields, particularly engineering and computer science, women are drastically underrepresented. And if you drill that down further and talk about Native American women, it's almost non-existent. So one of the things that we really are looking at and working on is, and again, I think Tara can speak to this, is starting early, right? You want to get girls way before middle school, because chances are if you wait, till middle school or beyond, then you're not going to get them at all. So I think that's one of the things that we need to fundamentally change if we want to think about this from an equity standpoint, is how early we're starting and how we're teaching, because certainly it's different for girls and boys as they get into adolescence and beyond. And so starting that early and making those connections is important. And that's something that, again, that we're trying to do, because we see the majority of those jobs going to white men, quite honestly. So,
well, you're making such an important point. It's very interesting to us where we're dealing so often at the intersection of various types of justices and injustice and how society functions, right? So you have within tribal communities that have suffered historic racism, you have also issues of gender and orientation and treatment of people across genders, right? You have within the community of women, girls, who have been systematically tilted toward not pursuing certain careers or not having certain opportunities open to them. You have racism, right, amongst different groups, right? So you have this interesting intersectionality amongst different Americans in which we really do have problems to discuss with one another. Tara, when you look at what you do, and you made some reference to disparities that are based in race, people of color, and so on, how do you deal with these issues? It looks to me as if you each have tremendous intersectionality here, right? Sarah was talking about girls and disparities in girls in Native communities, and you talk about girls, and then you also talk about disparities, people of color amongst girls that you are supporting. How do you ensure that you're trying to deal with the intersectional elements here? Is it more about discussion? Is it about the staff that you employ? Is it about the communities that you serve? How do you deal with that from a strategic point of view?
I think so. We've been running for 15 years, and I've learned quite a bit because we get most of our funding from the STEM industry, and I'm learning that I think a big problem is sort of the capitalistic framework is you have one metric that you're optimizing for, right? Like it's your bottom line number.
Profit.
And profit, or just one number, because we want to simplify our systems. Funders give you a grant and they say, okay, what's your metric of success? Here are your KPIs. And that kind of framework doesn't really fit in with complex social problems that have multiple feedback loops at multiple time cycles. So it's not just.
And I see Sarah is smiling here about your point, right? I suspect we have violent agreement, right, Sarah?
Yes, definitely.
Go ahead, Tara. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, and I think so for us, it's never about. I think that was the Technovation model where you have a whole community and multiple impacts and metrics of successes. And a very common point of feedback, there would be two things that would come back. You lack focus, and second, that your approach is very hard to understand because it is not just teaching girls how to code. That we can understand, but you are saying, oh, you're going to train parents, you're going to build capacity with mentors, you're going to help them teach real world problems. And coding is just one part of it. And so people have a hard time understanding that. But guess what? That's what makes impact. And now we have 10 years sort of look back data to show that what happens to these young women when 10 years after the program, and turns out 76% of them are pursuing STEM degrees, 60% of them are actually in STEM careers, because this multifaceted approach was something that really stuck with them. And so I think my main point of feedback would be for complex social problems that have been with us for many years, we need complex multidimensional solutions. And so you got to stop saying, what is the silver bullet that we need? So I will end with that.
So that intersectionality answer is you're saying it's not just one thing. It's involving the entire community. Sarah, do you basically take that same approach?
Yes, most definitely. Teachers, and that's another thing, we need more Indigenous teachers for sure. But yeah, entire communities, a community-based approach. You have to have, in order to have healthy kids, you have to have healthy communities and healthy families. So certainly that's part of it. And why I think also, employers often are surprised when they hire Indigenous people to work in their companies, because they are used to working in a setting where it's about community and not about individual achievement. So they're very good team players, and also think differently, I guess I would say, from coming out of the reservation, other places that Native people come from, and into the workforce. But on the intersectionality piece, I do think it's important. And one of the things that we do is we're in a number of coalitions with the National Society of Black Engineers and Hispanic Professional Engineers and women engineers and others, where we work together and try to find commonalities and things, take on projects, because we recognize as a group, or when we work together, that as Tara was talking about with funders, it's easier to get support, I guess, when we're working together and can present more of a cohesive picture and address intersectionality. And on that note, I'm actually on a committee, and there'll be a report coming out of the National Academies, hopefully later this year, that we've been working on about women of color in tech. And so, and that really is looking at intersectionality and what needs to happen for women of color to be successful in tech.
So the people you work with for that are the Anita Borg folks. We recruited Brenda Darden Wilkerson to them, and as well as their CIO. They are just an amazing organization. It's the largest organization of women in technology globally, and just phenomenal. I'm sure they will be great supporters of yours. I did want to just mention that we just completed a third poll, and we're going to come to the end of our time now. So I'm going to give you each a bite at the apple to close us off. But the poll was, how important to business success is ethnic and gender diversity in the STEM workforce? 92% of respondents said very important, 8% said somewhat important. But there does seem to be a huge consensus on this. How do we change in the future this dynamic? It seems that you each have been doing your work for a long period of time. The change is not a light switch. You can't just turn change on. But we do need to accelerate the pace of change. If you were to each give us one thing that we should change about all of our behaviors, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of orientation, what is the one thing that we should do to change ourselves in order to speed change for society? So let's start off with Sarah, and then we'll give Tara the last word. Sarah, what is the one thing that I need to change about myself to help you and your mission?
Well, I don't know if you need to change because I don't know where you stand on this, but I will say, I think what we need to do is shift our thinking collectively, in that a lot of times we're viewed as charity, or right, this is something, oh, we should hire X number of Native Americans and X number of women and X number of Hispanics or whatever. We should make sure they have equal opportunity because it's the right thing to do, rather than seeing that as being something that's positive and something that's good and something that will actually help our country thrive. So businesses do better when they have diverse teams. So I think shifting our mindset that it's not something that we're doing to help this poor community, but really understanding that this is something that we should be doing because it's for the good of all of us, and that it will benefit all of us. And so that's a fundamental shift in the way that you work with people and the way you treat people when you work with them, work with people of color, right? Is that it's not parity. It's not I'm trying to do something good. It's more like I'm recognizing the value in these people.
You're also trying to help the country and your business and your neighbor, right, in the way that we should be doing, right?
Exactly.
It's no different. It's listening to a need, trying to convey, making a contribution, and then having a benefit yourself, right, from having someone who is educated, from somebody who can help you, understand the world better. Tara, what is the one thing that I need to do in your mind, in myself? What is the thing that I need to evolve in me to help you in your mission?
I think I say what Sarah said. I don't know where you stand, Mark, but I think one thing I learned reading Nelson Mandela's book, which was very, very interesting insight, was that most of us have been brought up on the literature of white people, and to begin to slowly change our minds and to be open to a different way of thinking, we've got to read the books of different communities and their literature, because it's beyond social media. We're just reading, even going through some sort of unconscious bias training there's no training that has documented evidence that it works, right? Like, these are deeply seated ideas that we have, and the only way to sort of change them is by spending time thinking and reading is one of the best ways, like reading actual books by different Native communities, but also communities that are marginalized. There's amazing literature out there, and that's how you sort of build these stories and narratives in your head that you can reach into when you're trying to convince yourself of a different point of view. So I've been doing that, and I've found that it's actually not so as it would seem, much faster than not doing it.
You know, I think you both know where I stand, but I want to be serious for a moment. No matter where you stand, learning is a continual process of self-correction, of becoming more knowledgeable and evolving your views. I think that part of my answer to that question is that we need to constantly listen. And this is part of my meditation. I want to thank you both for helping us understand a little bit more about your worlds, the communities that you serve, and perhaps allowing us to be a little bit not only more informed, but also more part of the solutions that you provide for society. Sarah EcoHawk of ISIS, American Indian Science and Engineering Society, and Tara Chklovski, founder and CEO of Technovation. Thank you so much for sharing your work. That's the nonprofit report. Participants, thank you so much for coming. Please tell your friends, and we'll see you on Thursday, where we'll be talking about gun violence and how we can stop it in America. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.